On the morning of May 17th, 1606, conspirators stormed the Moscow Kremlin, intent on removing an imposter from the Russian throne. The Tsar, a young man who had held that throne for less than a year, tried to flee, leaping from a window and fracturing his leg in the fall. He was dragged from a bathhouse where he'd tried to hide and was brutally chopped to pieces by a mob of vengeful Russian nobles, known as boyars. His corpse was put on public display, a gruesome warning to all who would challenge the old order. His body was burned, and in a final symbolic act of ultimate rejection, his ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired west, back towards Poland, the land from which this impostor came. This act of extreme desecration begs a question that still echoes through history. Who was this man? Was he, as he and his followers passionately claimed, Tsarevich Dmitri, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, miraculously saved from assassins years earlier? Or was he, as his enemies insisted, a charlatan, a runaway monk named Grigory Otrepyev, who perpetrated one of the most audacious frauds in world history? This is the bizarre true story of false Dmitri I, a complete unknown who managed to rise from nothing to the Russian throne. At the turn of the 17th century, Russia was a nation balanced on a knife's edge, a tinderbox of social, political, and spiritual anxieties waiting for a spark. The crisis began with the death of Tsar Ivan IV, better known as the Terrible, in 1584. Ivan's reign had been a study in brutal contradiction. He had forged a powerful, centralized Muscovite state, but he had done so through a reign of terror, the Oprichnina, that shattered the old nobility and left a legacy of paranoia and fear. More disastrously for the kingdom, in a fit of rage, he cut down his eldest son and capable heir, effectively signing the death warrant for his own dynasty. This left the throne to his other son, Fyodor I, a man of weak intellect and feeble constitution, wholly incapable of ruling. With Fyodor's accession, the Rurik dynasty, a line of rulers stretching back over 700 years to the very foundations of the Rus, was ruler in name only. The real power lay with a council of boyars, chief among them Fyodor's ambitious and exceedingly capable brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. The dynasty was teetering, and the entire political structure of Russia was about to come crashing down. The final flickering hope for the Rurik line rested on Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Dmitri Ivanovich, born from his 7th marriage. This marriage, unlike his previous 6, wasn't recognized by the Orthodox Church as being legitimate. As the power behind Fyodor's throne, Boris Godunov recognized the young Tsarevich as the primary threat to his own ambitions. He acted decisively, exiling the boy Dmitri and his mother's family to the provincial town of Uglich, about 150 miles north of Moscow. There, on May 15th, 1591, the 8-year-old Dmitri was found dead in a courtyard. The official investigation, conveniently headed by a prominent boyar, Prince Vasily Shuisky, quickly reached a very suspicious conclusion. And you're going to want to keep this prince's name in mind, because let's just say he's going to be coming up a lot throughout this video. The boy, who was legitimately known to suffer from epilepsy, had experienced a seizure while playing with a knife and had fallen on it, slashing his throat. It was a neat, if somewhat implausible explanation, and for obvious reasons, very few actually believed it. Dmitri's mother and her relatives immediately cried that this was a political assassination, accusing Godunov's agents of eliminating the last true heir. The accusation resonated powerfully across Russia. Godunov was the man who stood to gain the most from the boy's death, and the suspicion was that he had cleared his path to the throne with the death of an innocent. The death at Uglich created a foundational national myth. In the popular imagination, Dmitri became a martyred innocent, and the true Tsarevich would stage a miraculous return and restore order from the chaos that would follow. When the childless and mentally incompetent Tsar Fyodor I finally died in 1598, the Rurik dynasty officially ended. Had young Dmitri still been alive at this time, he almost certainly would have been elevated to the throne, but he was officially deceased, so another method was chosen. A national assembly, the Zemsky Sobor, elected Boris Godunov to the throne. He was a ruler of great skill and intelligence, but he was not of royal blood, and in the rigidly hierarchical world of the Muscovite Tsardom, this was a fatal flaw. The great boyar clans, like the Romanovs and Shuskis, viewed him as a usurper. In response, Godunov ruled with a heavy hand, persecuting his rivals and creating a fearful atmosphere of spies, denunciations, and political purges. To shore up the state's finances and the military service class that was his main base of support, Godunov enacted policies that made him deeply unpopular. He accelerated the process of encirclement, tying peasants more firmly to the land, and imposed heavy taxes on the townsfolk. These measures alienated vast swathes of the population, from the powerful nobles he repressed to the common people he burdened. His legitimacy was paper-thin, resting on an election rather than divine right, and he was widely despised as the man who had stolen the throne from the martyred Dmitri. To make matters worse for Tsar Boris, that legend of Dmitri as a potential rightful savior only grew as his reign became more repressive. Then, an event on the other side of the world sealed Godunov's fate and plunged Russia into utter chaos. In 1600, a volcano named Huayna Putina erupted in Peru. It was one of the most powerful eruptions of the last millennium, ejecting millions of tons of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere. This created a volcanic winter, a global atmospheric veil that blocked sunlight and caused a dramatic drop in temperatures worldwide. In Russia, the consequences were apocalyptic. The summers of 1601 and 1602 were brutally cold, with frosts occurring even in July and August. The crops failed, not once, but for 3 consecutive years. The result was the Great Famine of 1601 to 1603, the single worst famine in Russian history, and when you're talking about Russian history, this title is no joke. An estimated 2 million people, nearly a third of the entire population, starved to death over these years, and society disintegrated. Landowners, unable to feed their own households, cast out their serfs, sending them to starve. Hordes of desperate, starving people roamed the countryside, and let's just say that near the end, despite all livestock being dead, meat was very much still on the menu. Godunov's government tried to help, distributing grain from state granaries, but the efforts were too little, too late, and only served to bankrupt the treasury. To the Russian people, who had no knowledge of volcanic aerosols or global weather patterns, the explanation for this unprecedented suffering was obvious and terrifying. The famine wasn't a natural disaster, it was an act of God. It was divine punishment for the sins of their illegitimate Tsar, who came to the throne by sending his hitmen after the last true Rurikid heir. The Tsar had wiped out the consecrated bloodline that had been responsible for the ethnogenesis of the Russian people and for bringing the Orthodox faith to their lands. This belief in Boris as a figure of complete evil utterly destroyed what little legitimacy he had left. As Russia starved and descended into chaos, a charismatic young man appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He carried with him an incredible story. He was Tsarevich Dmitri, son of Ivan the Terrible, and he had miraculously escaped Godunov's assassins in 1591. He was returning to claim his rightful throne from the usurper. The identity of this man remains one of history's great mysteries. Boris Godunov's government immediately launched a propaganda campaign, identifying the pretender as one Grigory Otrepyev. According to this story, he was a runaway monk from a minor noble family who had once served the Romanovs, Godunov's chief rivals. Many historians today accept this identification, believing him to be an exceptionally clever and ambitious imposter. Yet, there's a fascinating and complicating possibility. The man may have sincerely believed he was the Tsarevich. Whether through delusion, indoctrination by others, or even the knowledge that he possessed the hidden truth that he was Dmitri, he played the part of a long-lost royal with conviction. He was well-educated, spoke with a regal air, and even bore a passing resemblance to the young Dmitri. This psychological depth elevates him from a simple con man to a far more compelling historical figure, a man whose self-belief was so powerful it bent reality around him. The pretender found the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to be fertile ground for his ambitions. He assembled a motley coalition of backers, each with their own reasons for supporting his claim. This wasn't a state-sponsored invasion, but rather a privately funded venture, an opportunistic gamble by individuals seeking to profit from Russia's weakness. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a nobles' republic, where the king's power was limited, and great magnates wielded immense influence and commanded their own private armies. He had a number of key supporters in the Commonwealth. Powerful and self-serving nobles saw in Dmitri a golden opportunity for personal enrichment and political influence. Jerzy Mniszek became the pretender's commander-in-chief and, in a masterstroke of cynical ambition, betrothed his 15-year-old daughter, Marina, to the would-be Tsar. Notably, while the king of the Commonwealth wouldn't fully commit to Dmitri, he did provide some funding to him, hoping for a pro-Polish ruler in Moscow. And then there were the Jesuits, who as fervent agents of the Counter-Reformation saw Dmitri as a divine instrument. They hoped to use him to convert Orthodox Russia to Catholicism, bringing the vast realm under the authority of the Pope and creating a united Christian front against the Ottoman Empire. To secure their support, the pretender formally converted to Catholicism in a private ceremony on April 17, 1604. In the fall of 1604, Dmitri crossed the border into Russia at the head of a small army of about 3,500 men, composed mostly of Polish mercenaries. Militarily, the campaign was initially a disaster. Godunov's much larger army met the invaders and defeated them decisively. The pretender's Polish forces began to desert, and the entire enterprise seemed on the verge of collapse. But Dmitri had made a brilliant strategic decision. Instead of a direct assault on Moscow, he had taken a circuitous route through the southern provinces of Russia. These were the very regions most ravaged by famine and most hostile to Godunov's rule. Here, his message found a rapturous audience, and he wasn't seen as a foreign invader, but as a rightful king returning to save his people. Rumors of the true Tsar's arrival spread like wildfire. Disaffected Cossacks, runaway serfs, impoverished gentry, and entire towns rose up and flocked to his banner. What had begun as a failed military invasion was transformed into a massive popular uprising against Godunov. The final obstacle vanished on April 13, 1605, when Tsar Boris Godunov, ill and despised, suddenly died. With his death, the regime he had built crumbled overnight. His 16-year-old son, Fyodor II, was proclaimed Tsar, but his reign would last only a few weeks. The government army, which had been fighting against Dmitri, promptly switched its allegiance and joined him. In Moscow, the boyars, led by the opportunistic Vasily Shuisky, saw their chance to be rid of the Godunovs forever and brutally snuffed out his entire line. The path was clear, and on June 20, 1605, The man claiming to be Dmitri made his triumphal entry into Moscow, greeted by ecstatic crowds who saw him as a divine figure. The ultimate act of political theater sealed his legitimacy. The real Dmitri's mother, Maria Nagaya, was brought out from the convent where she had lived for years. Before the assembled people, she tearfully embraced the pretender and publicly recognized him as her long-lost son. On July 21st, he was crowned in the Dormition Cathedral of the Kremlin as Dmitry Ivanovich, Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia. Tsar Dmitri was a monarch unlike any Russia had ever known. He was young, energetic, charismatic, and shockingly informal, a hip new Tsar for a new generation. He rejected the stiff, almost priestly rituals of the Muscovite court, preferring to walk unescorted through the city and personally oversee the workings of government. He shocked the conservative boyars by appearing clean-shaven and favoring Western-style clothing. For a brief, dizzying 11 months, it seemed as though a new Western European-style era had dawned in Russia. During his short reign, Dmitri embarked on a series of reforms that were remarkably forward-thinking for their time and place. He displayed an ambition that went far beyond simply holding on to power, suggesting a genuine, if perhaps naive, vision for a different kind of Russia. He took immediate steps to address the grievances that had fueled his rise. He restored a system where serfs could legally switch between masters during one narrow window every year, making him very popular with the people. This might not sound like much. They were still serfs after all. But this system had provided some checks on the power of harsh landowners. One couldn't simply exploit one's serfs to the maximum extent possible, because they could just up and leave during that short window in November. He also reversed many of Godunov's political purges, pardoning and restoring the lands and titles of noble families who had been exiled, including the powerful Romanovs. Dmitri dreamed on a continental scale, and his grand project was to form a broad Christian coalition with Poland, the papacy, the Habsburgs, and other European powers. His purpose was to wage a holy war against the Ottoman Empire and free the Balkans from the clutches of the Ottomans. In preparation, he ordered the mass production of modern firearms and began to reorganize the army along Western lines. In his diplomatic correspondence, he even styled himself Emperor of Russia, a title that Peter the Great wouldn't formally adopt for another century. This signaled his desire for Russia and Moscow to be seen as the Third Rome, on equal footing with the great powers of Europe. Despite having converted to Catholicism to win Polish and Jesuit support, Dmitri proved to be a pragmatist in matters of faith. He understood that forcing Catholicism on his deeply Orthodox subjects wouldn't be viable. He refused to grant the Jesuits special privileges or build Catholic churches, angering this influential faction. In a move of startling openness, he even permitted the Catholic and Protestant soldiers in his guard to pray in Orthodox churches. This wasn't viewed as a positive thing by the highly conservative Orthodox priesthood, who viewed this as heresy at best and desecration of holy ground at worst. In hindsight, Dmitri's reign appears as a fascinating historical what-if. He was, in essence, a proto-Westernizer, attempting to implement the kind of military, social, and diplomatic reforms that Peter the Great would later force upon the country. However, his Western dress, his clean-shaven face, his European alliances, and his religious tolerance weren't seen as signs of progress. Instead, they were successfully framed as proof of his foreignness, as evidence of a sinister Polish Catholic plot to subvert the traditions of Russia. While the common people initially adored their charismatic and accessible Tsar, the traditional elites, the boyars, and the Orthodox clergy grew increasingly alarmed. They were alienated by his blatant favoritism towards the Poles, Germans, Scandinavians, and others who filled his court and received prime appointments. The breaking point came in May 1606 with his marriage to the Polish Catholic princess Marina Mniszek. She arrived in Moscow with a large, rowdy, and arrogant Polish entourage that treated the capital as a conquered city. Critically, Marina refused to convert to Russian Orthodoxy before the wedding, a shocking breach of tradition that seemed to confirm the worst fears of the Muscovites. The wedding celebration was intended to be the crowning moment of Dmitri's reign, but instead it became the catalyst for his destruction. The conspiracy that brought down Tsar Dmitri was engineered by a man who was the living embodiment of boyar cynicism and political cunning, Prince Vasily Shuisky, a descendant of the ancient Rurikid princes. He was a master of political survival. His career demonstrates a remarkable talent for opportunistic deception. In 1591, to please the powerful regent Boris Godunov, Shuisky led the investigation that concluded Dmitri had died by accident. However, despite this official story, it was always suspected that he had been the one tasked by Boris with committing this disturbing crime against this innocent party. He was the one who officially told the Russian nobility that the real Dmitri fell on a knife. Yet in 1605, to help overthrow the Godunov dynasty, he completely reversed his story, swearing that Dmitri had survived and that the pretender was the legitimate heir to the throne. Then, shortly after Dmitri was crowned, Shuisky was caught plotting against him. The new Tsar, in a display of either magnanimity or foolishness, pardoned him from the executioner's block and allowed him to return to court. Shuisky repaid this kindness by immediately starting a new conspiracy, one that would ultimately have him declared Tsar himself. The week-long wedding festivities in May 1606 provided the perfect opportunity for the conspirators. Moscow seethed with resentment at the thousands of Polish guests who swaggered through the streets, flouting local customs. Shuisky and his allies capitalized on this xenophobia, spreading a terrifying rumor. Tsar Dmitri was about to unleash his Polish guards on the people of Moscow, locking the city gates and commencing a massacre of the Russian populace. On the morning of May 17th, the conspirators rang the great alarm bell, the traditional signal for a popular uprising. Shuisky rode into Red Square, holding a cross and declaring that the time had come to defend the Orthodox faith against the heretic on the throne. A mob of boyars, their armed retainers, and enraged citizens stormed the Kremlin. Dmitri was swiftly slain, and the violence ended up spreading into a xenophobic pogrom against all foreigners in Moscow, with a particular focus on Poles and Catholics. The elimination of false Dmitri didn't end the time of troubles, not even close, and in fact, as we will see, it didn't even eliminate the concept of false Dmitris. Rather, it plunged Russia deeper into the abyss, and Shuisky's reign was illegitimate from the start, and the crown that lay on his head would soon lay heavy enough to fracture his neck. The assassination of the first false Dmitri didn't put to rest the idea of Dmitri the Savior. The myth of the true Tsar had become a self-sustaining political force, a symbol of opposition so powerful that it no longer needed a credible vessel. In August 1607, a second imposter, false Dmitri II, appeared in southern Russia. This new pretender, believed to have been a priest's son or a teacher, bore no physical resemblance to his predecessor, but it didn't matter. He claimed to be Tsar Dmitri, miraculously rescued from the 1606 massacre, and that was enough. Now personally, I know this guy is called False Dmitri II by historians, but I would actually call him False Dmitri I, given what he was claiming. And trust me, Dmitriception isn't going to be ending anytime soon. This version of Dmitri quickly amassed a huge army of Cossacks, Polish adventurers, and all who were disaffected with Shusky's rule. He marched towards Moscow and established a rival court, a shadow government, in the village of Tushino, just outside the capital's walls. In a moment of supreme political theater that bordered on the surreal, Marina Mniszek, the widow of the first false Dmitri, was brought to the Tushino camp. In a purely transactional and cynical act to reclaim her status as Tsarina, she publicly quote-unquote recognized this total stranger as her miraculously saved husband. The Dmitri phenomenon was no longer about a specific person. It was an I am Spartacus moment for everyone standing against the current order. Or I suppose you could say I am Demetrius given the context. Russia now had 2 czars, 2 governments, and 2 armies, and the country disintegrated into a brutal civil conflict. Desperate, Tsar Shusky made a fateful alliance with Sweden, promising territorial concessions in exchange for military aid to fight this second false Dmitri. This foreign intervention gave Poland's King Sigismund III the pretext he had been waiting for. Viewing the Russo-Swedish alliance as a threat, he declared war on Russia in 1609, and this time he invaded with the full might of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was one of the most powerful states in Europe at the time, at least, when its nobles could be corralled to a common cause. However, this was a bit like herding a group of cats. An alliance between Russia and Sweden deeply threatened the powerful nobles of the Commonwealth, and Moscow became a big tuna for the Polish cat to feast upon. What had begun as a private adventure had now escalated into a full-scale international conflict for the soul of Russia. As is often the case in Russian history, the chaos only deepened from there. False Dmitri II was eliminated by one of his own followers in December 1610. Shusky was deposed by his own boyars and forced into a monastery. Polish forces defeated the Russian army and occupied Moscow itself. A third false Dmitri even made a brief appearance in 1611. But just like with The Godfather Part 3, this one didn't quite hit the same. The third one received an even more disappointing sequel, known as False Dmitri IV. This final false Dmitri may have just been the third false Dmitri, recorded by different sources the next year. The Russian state had effectively gone extinct, consumed by an invasive proliferation of its numerous Dmitris. It was only then, with the nation on the verge of total collapse and under foreign occupation, that a true national resistance finally emerged. A new army came together and was able to oust the Poles from Moscow in 1612. In 1613, a great national assembly elected Michael Romanov as the new Tsar. His family name, which will be familiar to most fans of history, may signal to you that this one would be a bit different. Michael Romanov would signal the end of the times of trouble and the establishment of a dynasty that would last into the 20th century. The question of who the first false Dmitri really was remains a great unsolved mystery of history. The answer is in essence a complete unknown, and there are as many theories out there as there are scholars on this period of history. However, he was fully literate and spoke French fluently, indicating that he came from at least a high noble background. Importantly, some subscribe to the theory that false Dmitri wasn't so fake at all. As you'll recall, Prince Vasily Shusky, the one who ruled that the real Dmitri was dead, changed his story numerous times over the years. In a dark twist, some historians believe that the prince had his men hunt down a peasant boy who looked like the real Dmitri and eliminated him. Under this theory, the real Dmitri's mother had him sent away for his safety. Prince Shusky, not wanting to get executed for this blunder, then presented the body of the unfortunate peasant boy to Boris Godunov. As for the legacy of the first false Dmitri, The evidence suggests a complicated figure. While he was undeniably dependent on Polish support, he was no one's pawn. He skillfully resisted the demands of his backers, refusing to cede Russian territory or force Catholicism upon his people, much to the frustration of his supporters. He was an intelligent, ambitious, and surprisingly capable ruler who, in his brief time in power, attempted genuine reforms that hinted at a more open future for Russia. He can be seen as a tragic figure, a would-be reformer whose vision was utterly incompatible with the deeply traditional society he sought to lead. His story is that of a man tragically out of his time, whose own cultural missteps and the ruthless ambition of the boyar elites led to his violent end. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a moment to remind you to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family, as well as any Dmitris in your life.